very rich comments. Our next speaker is Dr. Peter Bandettini. I believe I got it right that time, and I apologize again. He is the chief of the section on functional imaging methods in the Laboratory of Brain and Cognition of the Intramural Research Program at the NIH, National Institutes of Mental Health, NIMH. There, he is also director of the Functional MRI Core Facility. And Dr. Bandettini has investigated methods to increase the interpretability, resolution, and applicability of fMRI techniques. He's been awarded the Scientific Director's Merit Award for his efforts in establishing the NIH fMRI Core Facility and the Wiley Young Investigator Award at the Annual Organization of Human Brain Mapping meetings. In 2005, he served as president of the Organization for Human Brain Mapping and is currently editor-in-chief of the journal Neuroimage. His laboratory is currently developing MRI methods to improve the spatial resolution, temporal resolution, sensitivity, interpretability, and applicability of fMRI. Welcome, Dr. Bandettini.
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. My comments are going to be when I prepared this talk, I actually tried to frame the problem as simply as possible, and other introductions have been a little bit better. But actually, I think that what I'm going to try to do right here is just frame the primary issue and just to reemphasize some points that I think are important to me. First of all, I'm a researcher. I'm not an MD, and I've been doing fMRI research for about 20 years now, and I've come across some incidental findings. And so this is the way I actually look at this issue. So doing the research, there's about 2% of normal research volunteers have an incidental finding of clinical significance. And it's actually unknown how many truly benefit from follow-up on this. Those statistics are not available. And then the question then is, okay, so what should be done procedurally? So just a little bit of background, what I think are the related issues. First of all, active brain screening can be expensive and has no clear benefit, at least in the context of neuroimaging, over treatment following symptoms. So for instance, people can be walking around with tumors all their lives and not have any manifestation of that. So there's obviously other imaging modalities for looking at other parts of the body that are useful, but in the context of the brain, it's a little bit less useful. So false positives are a real risk. They can have deleterious effects, impact on otherwise normal subjects. As was mentioned before, it can obviously infect people's insurance and so on. And it's very difficult to necessarily quell those concerns once they've been brought up, even if they're not clinical. So, and also, this is, I think, the most important thing that's actually been mentioned in the context of genetics as well, but very different for imaging, and that is most research scans are not clinical grade. In that when I collect functional MRI data, and so I run a facility that we have 30 PIs, they collect either functional or some anatomical data. It's the functional scans are incredibly low resolution. The anatomic contrast is very low, and even the anatomic images that are collected with the functional scans are not clinical grade. So for instance, if somebody does report some symptoms, they go into a clinic, they might have a very high resolution scan, and they might have something like gadolinium or external contrast agents added where people are specifically looking for something. And the question is whether we should be doing that as well if we're not looking for something. And then the next point along those lines then is that most researchers are not qualified to read scans for diagnoses. So including myself, for instance, when I came across one subject wwho I thought had an incidental finding, they had very large ventricles, and I was concerned that they had very large ventricles. And this was when I was still a graduate student, and I showed them the scan. I said, "Oh, this looks really scary," and we finally went to a radiologist who then said, "Oh no, that's within the realm of normal." But I mean, what happened though is that the researcher was alarmed, and I think they still had some residual alarm after that as well. So those are very real issues that came from somebody who was trying to interpret a scan who wasn't qualified to do that. So, and also you have, as I mentioned before, the prevalence of lifelong asymptomatic individuals who might have lesions or tumors. That statistic is unknown as well. So we just don't know that. So this is a detailed, basically one study. There's two studies right here. I just wanted to simply show that too much information right here that to really talk about. But basically, the incidence over as more and more studies come in is about 2%, and that's pretty much the main figure. It goes up as people increase in age. Above 60 or 70 years old, it gets close to 8% or 10%. But it's about 2%, and that both this study and this other study showed that. So, and just to emphasize from one of the papers that I referred you for extra information, is that so researchers who obtain consent from volunteers should provide information about the prevalence of incidental brain findings on brain MRI, the higher prevalence with higher resolution sequences, and the shortage of evidence to inform their management. And I just want to bring out one point here is that really the harder you look, the more you'll find, and it's a continuum. It's not a discrete function. So with our research grade scans, we won't really find much, and we're not really looking. If we decide, we have an obligation to look more, we'll find more. And really, if you do clinical grade scans, you'll more likely find even more. So where do you draw that line in terms of how much effort you put into the quality of your research scans? And this is another quote from one of the papers as well. Brain MR screening in asymptomatic patients, regardless of age, medical history, is an example of an ineffective screening program that would produce many inconsequential findings and an exceedingly low rate of clinically relevant findings. So valuable screening programs must either address a highly prevalent disease or be applied to high-risk individuals and must accurately uncover a treatable disease. In other words, here they're basically saying in the context of screening, and I know that's different than doing research and looking for things, but the similarities are that this paper argues that you really should be looking for something in order to, if you're collecting all this multidimensional information. Otherwise, you might have more false positives, and you might miss a lot, and so it's really not exactly the right place to put this type of effort, in the context of research at least. So. And okay, so once again, this is more detail than you need to see, and I'll just summarize this. So there's a whole spectrum of how clinical centers go about handling incidental finding procedures in research, and it's wide open. It's still kind of like the Wild West in some ways, in that some clinical centers have scanners that are used not in a clinical setting. So they have a very minimal type of procedure in which no action is taken beyond articulating a plan for handling incidental findings in the informed consent process. So, the unqualified person, if they happen to see something, they'll refer to a radiologist potentially. Well, actually, that's even less than that. They might even say, we're not going to even look. If we think we see something, we're not going to tell you. And there's a whole continuum of what people can do all the way up to where I'm actually at the NIH. We have an extremely conservative approach. All people doing research scans have to also get a clinical grade scan once a year. We have repeat volunteers, and even the repeat volunteers have to come back every single year, have a clinical grade scan that then is read by a radiologist. The cost overhead of this and the infrastructure is somewhat high. Some people argue about what the actual cost is. I also think it's a little bit burdensome for the researcher as well. So there's all types of things in between that are, once again, potentially dangerous. Having a radiologist, for instance, try to interpret a research grade scan is difficult. They're going to make more errors, either negative or positive. So then the question is, should there be a standard policy? Should it be a wide open policy? Should it be tailored to specific needs and specific resources of the clinical center or the research center? And that's sort of unknown right now. And lastly, this is actually from a talk from Judy Isles gave, and I'm not going to focus on once again the details, but these are the various decision points at which a person could make a decision as to what to do about the incidental finding or how to manage incidental findings. And so there's several different decision points where I have question marks are the unknowns. Like, for instance, how do we actually detect the incidental finding, for instance, and who is qualified to read the scans and when? And when they read the scans, who pays for the follow-up? Who actually pays for the subject to go to their physician to get follow-up scans or follow-up research? Okay, so lastly, as I finish up here, so framing the challenge, at least the way I see it. On one hand, we want to catch anything that obviously might be significant to the health of the subject. On the other hand, what exactly would justify the added cost and burden risk of false positives, as well as the fact that the overall effectiveness of screening is unclear? And so therefore, can we even put it in this framework of what incidence rate would justify what effort, even an effort of limited effectiveness and clear risks? So with that, I'd like to just conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It'll be interesting to, when we get to the full panel roundtable, to compare and contrast views on these things. Our last speaker for the panel has a unique relationship to this topic.